So welcome. Thank you all for coming to this session in which we're going to talk about our book called Educational Goods, Values, Evidence, and Decision Making. My name is Helen Ladd, although they're likely to call me Sonny Ladd. I answer to both. I'm a professor, recently retired professor of public policy at Duke University. On my right is Harry Brighouse from the philosophy department. No, philosophy, I'm an economist by training, he's a philosopher from the University of Wisconsin. And Susanna Loeb, who has the same sort of training as I do, economics and quantitative social science research. She used to be at Stanford, and she's now heading up the Annenberg Institute at Brown. So we have a fourth author as well, Adam Swift. He's now at University College London. So this was a big effort to put this book together. We come, two philosophers, two social scientists coming from different places around this country and England. And it was a really exciting experience. And we want to share our results and our approach with you today. If there's one basic takeaway that I want you to keep with take away with you as you leave, it's that good education policy making and decision making more generally should be values driven, but informed by evidence, not driven by evidence, but driven by values that are then informed by evidence. So that's the main point of our book. But if you're going to do that, we have to talk a lot about values, which we'll do. So one question is, who did we write the book for? We think it's for anybody who cares about education decision making. That includes parents, it includes teachers, it includes school administrators, it includes policymakers at the state level, policymakers at the federal level. But different people will approach the decision making with different weights on the values that we're going to talk about today. So there needs to be discussion about values, but we're also writing this for researchers, and that's extremely important. What are the important topics to research? It's those that'll shed light on the extent to which various policy options will realize the values that we care about. So we need to spend a lot of time talking about values. So let's move on. We start with this slide. This is not what we're about, but this is what the world has been about in the field of education policy. Everybody talks about data-driven decisions or evidence-based decisions. There's book after book, and I hear this all the time in my own home state of North Carolina and with federal policy. But as I said a minute ago, good policy making should be driven by values and informed by evidence and data. So let's go to the next one. So this is evidence and values. If I had been writing this slide rather than Harry, I would have put values and evidence, but that's fine. So, you know, for researchers, if you're thinking about what it is you want, that's important for you to do research on, or if you're a policymaker or a parent or a teacher trying to figure out what to do within the school and the classroom, you need to think about what it is that you care about. What are your values? Where are you trying to go? So we have a map here. Map's not going to do you any good if you don't know where you're headed or what it is you want to do. And this map may not even be the right map. You may need a different map because of you need to think more broadly about where it is you're headed. So let me turn now to Harry, because we need to start out talking about values, and that's what Harry's going to talk. But while I have the floor, and I'll say this, no, I'm going to let you do it. This book came out in 2018. It's University of Chicago Press. There are some copies of it upstairs in the exhibition hall. There's a 30% discount if you buy it here. But we're happy to talk to you all more about it after the session. All right.
Okay, so you know you need to know where you want to go. And what we discerned is 3 different categories of value, if you like. To some extent, how you exactly carve things up, the conceptual space is, you know, a matter of choice. So we sort of chose about where to put things. But we discerned educational goods, which is the name of the book. And so you might want to think of those as the central goods, though they sort of correspond to the aims of education. And then we identified distributive values, and we'll talk, I think, more briefly about that. And then independent values, values that you might have your educational aims, and you might have a lot of concern about how they get distributed, but there might be other considerations, value considerations that sort of might constrain you or might worry you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk now just about the educational goods and the distributive values, and then I'll hand over to Susanna. Okay. Oh, good. So here we've got a teacher, and I don't know why the children are looking at the camera, but they're also looking at the camera. And this is what she's asking us. What educational goods should I be trying to develop in my children? What knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions should I be trying to inculcate in the students that I'm teaching? And here's our answer. Those knowledge, skills, dispositions, and attitudes that enable students to flourish and contribute to the flourishing of others in the social context they will actually inhabit. So it's the sort of fundamental concern is human flourishing. It's ensuring that children, as they become adults, are able to flourish themselves. But, of course, being able to flourish yourself is not enough. You have power with respect to other people, and contributing to their flourishing is important too. Now, if this teacher said to us, "Can you be more helpful, please?" I would have a lot of sympathy. And so what I'm going to do is try to be more helpful. What I'm not going to do is, because it would take forever, and actually we haven't we haven't done it, is go into absolute detail. We're not going to prescribe a curriculum, you know, down to exactly what you should be doing now and in half an hour's time and in half an hour's time. But what we have done is discern 6 kind of capacities that are a fairly high level of abstraction, but represent the kinds of things you'd be thinking about when you are trying to develop a curriculum and an extracurriculum, and sort of how you think about the ethos of the school. First capacity is the capacity for economic productivity. Now, I'm in Canada now, so is Prince Charles Canada's prince as well? I don't know. I'm looking at you, Diane. Yeah, he is. So, you know, look, if you're Prince Charles, you do not need the capacity for economic productivity because you just got born into a family and you own all this stuff and whatever. But most people, not just in capitalist economies, but in other kind of economies, in order to flourish, they need to be able to be active in the economy. They need to be able to do that both to flourish themselves and in order to contribute to the flourishing of others. A lot of what we think of as contributing to the flourishing of others happens in the formal economy. A lot of it happens in the informal economy. We're talking about the economy, both formal and informal here. Now, exactly what that requires will differ a lot depending on context, depending on time, depending on where you are in the world. So, you know, my favorite example of this is the skills involved in typesetting. Typesetting was a highly skilled, very lucrative, really important skill in 1982, and it was basically economically useless in 1988. You really want to teach people how to be typesetters when it's economically useful, not when it's not. The next capacity is the capacity for democratic competence. We need this in order to treat other people right. So when you vote, what you're doing is you're calling on the government, which has an army and it has a police force, to force other people to do things. That's fine. But when you do call upon an authority to force other people to do things, you want to be doing it for the right reasons. You want to be thinking about all the things that go into that, and you also want to be doing it competently. It's not just that we need to have the right reasons when we vote. We need to know how to vote. We need to understand the system that we're in. The kinds of discernment that an American voter who votes in 15 different levels of election, half of which don't even have parties helping her figure out what anybody stands for, needs different things, and it needs different knowledge and skills than a voter in France, where all elections are partisan, where the electoral system is simpler, where you have proportional representation, and therefore parties give you more information. When you do have parties, they give you more information about candidates than in the US. The third capacity is the capacity for personal autonomy. You're supposed to laugh at the cartoon. It's funny. Why does personal autonomy matter so much? So different philosophers, by the way, there's a huge literature on personal autonomy and how to conceive of it, and we don't offer a narrow definition. But basically, you should think of this as the capacity to make your own independent judgments about what to do and about value matters, and to, at least in most circumstances, be able to enact those judgments. Why is that so important? In modern conditions, we face a complex world in which decisions require weighing values and also weighing evidence, the kind of decisions that we're trying to think about. And the capacities to do that are important if you're going to get things right, if you're going to flourish, if you're going to contribute well to the flourishing of others. There isn't somebody, for most of us, there isn't somebody else constantly with us. I have much better judgment than my daughter does. I'm just telling you that. But I'm not there all the time to tell her what to do. Even if I were there all the time to tell her what to do, things might go terribly wrong, because even though she'd be doing the right thing, she wouldn't be doing it authentically. And she might slack off. That's what life is like in modern conditions, and so we need this capacity. We also need the capacity for healthy emotional relationships. By the way, some of these capacities might sometimes be in tension with each other. I have this sort of vague suspicion that being emotionally unhealthy makes people, on the whole, economically more productive. And I think a lot of employers think that, like what we want is we want people who really are pretty screwed up, and then they'll just work and work and work. So it's not that these are always mesh well. You need a balance, you need to weigh them. And one of the things people disagree about is exactly how to weigh them. But a central part for most of us of what makes our lives go well is having healthy personal relationships, it's intimacy, and also an essential part, an important part of what makes other people's lives go well is healthy relationships with us. I mean, it's not just for yourself you need this capacity, it's for others you need it. We also discern the capacity to treat others as equals as essential. So, I mean, I have a colleague at a famous, very wealthy and old institution in the US on the East Coast, who sometimes says, look, there are two kinds of students in the world. There's the kind of students who need to learn that they're just as important as everybody else, and there's the students who need to learn that they're no more important than anybody else. And he said to me, and we've got a lot of the latter. Exactly why? Because treating others as equals enables them to flourish, but also enables you to flourish. There's something wrong with the people who think they're more important than anybody else. I'm not saying that you should feel so. I don't know, maybe we shouldn't make political jokes in here. So, for example, there's a president in the United States right now who seems to really be incapable of doing this, and I'm not asking you to feel sorry for him. Please don't feel sorry for him. But I do suspect there's something not quite right in his internal life. I think there's things that he's really missing out on too. I'm totally happy for him to miss out on them. But, and the third is, the sixth is the capacity for personal fulfillment. All of these capacities, I'll say a word more about this in a second, but all of these capacities are capacities that we want children to develop. They're all capacities that schools can do something about, and we'll talk about schools in a moment. They're all capacities that schools can't do anything about, you know, if they're really, if the broader society is really trying to stop them. But the capacity for personal fulfillment, I mean, you know, what you have here is you've got hobbies, right? Hobbies are important. And one of the things that happens in schools is you encounter people, if you're lucky, who expose you to activities that are really rewarding, that you wouldn't have come up with on your own, and that your parents wouldn't have come up with, and that your friends wouldn't have come up with. My parents are completely unmusical. My dad still, he's 78, he still doesn't care about any music at all. His friends tease him about it. I discovered a love of English folk music from a very eccentric teacher in high school. I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't been exposed to a different kind of person than my parents in a setting in which I was sort of had to get to know him. And that happens for lots of students if they're lucky. We care about developing these educational goods. We ought to care about them, but always in an educational system, but also in a society, we have reason to worry about who gets what. Resources are scarce. Resources have to be distributed. And we know that some people may do better than others. And so what we identified, so I think this is what people often are worrying about when they use the term equity. So I have a rule with my students, which is they're not allowed to use the word equity in my presence. Because I don't know how many people are in this room, it's somewhere around 50 or 60, and you all use the word equity, and by it you mean about 50 or 60 different things. I mean, they overlap, there's lots of things you have in common. You're all worried about distribution when you use it, but it's a kind of shorthand for I'm concerned with distribution, which doesn't get very precise. And so what we did, I'm going to simplify now. What we did was we came up with, in the philosophical literature, there are three basic categories of distributive value. Now, at one point, we managed to break these three categories down into, I think Adam and I did this, 12 subcategories. Don't worry, I'm not going to subject you to those. There are really three that we identified as being in operation and as ones that actually matter and that we ought to place some weight on. The first is equality, and by equality we mean that flourishing should be a function of neither social nor natural advantage. Basically what we would like, one thing we would care about, is people emerging from the educational process with roughly equal knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions. Now you're going to say to me, but in order to do that, we would have to severely constrain the education of people who are very naturally able. Or you're going to say, well, we'd have to prevent parents from ever investing in the education of their children. And yes, we would. And we don't necessarily want to do either of those things. And what that means is not that we shouldn't care about equality, but that we shouldn't only care about equality. Equality is one value, and it gets balanced against others. A more urgent value, because more achievable in the short term, is adequacy. We should care about everybody emerging into adulthood with a reasonable chance of attaining some threshold level of overall flourishing. Exactly how you interpret a reasonable chance of, and exactly how you interpret an overall, the threshold level, that's something we talk about some in the book, and I don't want to get into any detail here. It's something people can actually reasonably disagree about, and is one of the reasons that we offer these values with, they are quite abstract, but they're abstract enough that we think everybody should be able to sort of grasp them at some level. And the third is what we've called benefiting the less advantaged. Those of you who know political philosophy and sort of know John Rawls's theory will think, okay, this corresponds roughly to his difference principle. Yeah, that's exactly, well, it's exactly what it roughly corresponds to. Can I say exactly and roughly in the same sentence? If you really were sort of monomaniacally concerned with this, what you would be thinking is, we want students to emerge, we want to distribute educational experience and educational goods so that the people who do least well do better than they would under any other distribution. We're not monomaniacal about it, but when I think about education and education reform in the American context, the USA context, I think of this as being, in a way, the most urgent of the distributive values. When I hear policymakers talk or I hear teachers talk, I want them to be thinking as much as they feasibly can about the 30%, 35% of people who attend school who are not going to go to college at all, who are going to be in the most discomforting, insecure, lowest paid, least skilled part of the labour market for their lives, who are going to have insecure housing, who are going to have insecure food. I want their well-being to be at the forefront of everybody's minds when they're thinking about education matters. Now the independent values, which Susanna will talk about.
Okay, so we've got these two kinds of values that we've talked about already. We have educational goods, and that's generally what we think of education creating, and then we care also about their distribution. We've just gone through that. What I'm going to talk about now are a set of goals or values that we have that often come into play when we have education questions. So they're not directly about developing capacities in people, but they still end up being part of the discussion when we're talking about education policy or education decisions. And when I went into this project with my colleagues here and with Adam, I was thinking, oh, it's not even worth trying to think of all the other things that we care about because there are just too many of them. Well, as it turns out, there are only about 5 of them that are regular participants in discussion of education policy, and so you can really articulate those. And this might all seem, again, at kind of the 10,000-foot level, but our hope is that after we go through all of these, we'll also go through some examples where you see how they come into play. So I'm going to go through the 5. We find the first one particularly interesting, and this is the idea of childhood goods. So in addition to the capacities that you want to develop through education, you want to make sure that children and childhood is a big part of life, and there's some children's experience while they're children, while they're in school, is important, even if it isn't developing particular capacities that will serve them well later. And we all know this, but we didn't feel like we had a word that really describes it. And so we spend a bunch of time with this idea of childhood goods. And, adults have goods too. We care about our consumption as adults. But childhood is also a very special time where you have the opportunity to experience things for the first time, to discover and explore. And so we may feel particularly strong that some of these childhood goods are important and we may not want to give them up, even if it means that you develop fewer capacities for flourishing in the future. So childhood goods is the first independent value. The second one is the adult's consumption of goods, or the other kinds of goods, things we care about: housing, we care about ice cream, we care about all of the other things. And sometimes, for example, in finance, which we'll get to, there are trade-offs. If we put more money in education, we put less money in other kinds of things as well, some of which are government things, but some of which are just individuals' money to spend as they will. So that's a second independent value that we see as coming into play when you're talking about education decisions. The third one is parents' interest. And we may feel like we sometimes put too much emphasis on parents and their own interest in their children. But it is a value that many of us hold. So parenting is kind of is a very human experience. We get a lot of joy from it, and we wouldn't want to necessarily give it up. Now, we may weigh values differently. Some of us may care very much about parents' interests, and some of us may care less about parents' interests. Nonetheless, it is a value that comes into play when we're talking about education policies and what we force students to do or don't force them to do, what kinds of choices parents have. And one thing to remember, too, is that some of the things that parents do, it's not only that they're making choices that could affect what our policies do, but they're making choices on things like how much to read to their children, how much to invest in their children, which could have great implications for kind of the distribution and level of educational goods as well. Okay, so I think, how many is that? Well, let's see. I think there's another one in here. There are two more left. So we also care, and it comes into play sometimes, that individuals, adults, have freedom of choice of residence and of occupation. Freedom of choice generally is something that we care about for adults, but we are rarely willing to force people to be teachers or even more kind of directly force them to live, let's say, in an economically integrated community or something like that, which could really affect our school system, maybe for the better, but we still won't do it. So the independent value of individual freedom of residence and freedom of occupation does come into play when we're talking about some of the education policies. And then finally, an independent value that we hold, which often serves as just basically a constraint in what we can do, is the democratic process. And sometimes we want to do things, but if we do them or if we encourage our politicians to do them, they basically cannot get reelected. And so we have to work within the system with the famous quote, of course, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Okay, so are you taking over here or doing it? We're just going to keep trying to keep you awake here by moving us.
So I'm going to say a few words right now, and then we're going to come back to some examples. What do we do with all of this? These are interesting ideas, but let me just, wait a sec. Susanna?
Oh, sorry, I'm here. I've shirked my job.
Right, sorry. So in the book, we spend a lot of time talking about schools and school policy. But the term educational, in the term educational goods, goods are what we value. That's what we've been talking about for educational goods. The term educational, the way we use it, refers to a broad process of education. That includes what kids learn on the playground, the role of parents, the role of communities, and the role of schools. And we spend a lot of time talking about school policy, recognizing it's only one part of the broader process. But the reason we do that is this is the lever that governments have to affect some of these educational goods. And it's important that the government use this well. And we understand that different people are going to come away and say, well, particular value, maybe promoting capacity to work in the labor market is particularly appropriate for schools to do because that involves major cognitive skills, development of cognitive skills, and schools are good at that. And some people will say, well, developing healthy interpersonal relationship isn't specifically a role for schools, but other people would say, yes, it is. But if we have the language, and I put a lot of emphasis on language whenever I give talks about this book, we can then discuss which of these educational goods are most valued and which are most appropriate for the schools. So let's turn to the next one. So if we have all of these values, we know that evidence is important, then this, and if we can think hard about where we're trying to go, think back to the picture of the map, then that's going to help us as researchers, help you all as researchers, to figure out what research is most useful. a lot of research these days, and I know this, I'm an economist, I look at data, is based on test scores. How do test scores relate to all these educational goods we've been talking about? Well, they're not irrelevant. They're a imperfect measure of achievement. Achievement's useful for success in the labor market and for democratic competence and whatever, but it's not the only thing that is important. And so the fact that so many studies for the last 20 years have focused just on test scores is a mistake. We need to step back and say, what is it we're trying to do in our schools, and how do we achieve that? What are the policy tools we might use? So in the book, we have a chapter on school finance using some of these concepts, along with evidence to think about what this might imply for school finance. We have a chapter on accountability. Do we want test-based accountability for schools or some sort of inspectorate of the type that exists in the Netherlands or in many other countries, including England? So what sorts of factors do we need to consider as we're making discussions about policy and practice? Let me give just two brief, these are still general examples. The slide says, what is equitable? As Harry said, we don't like that term, equitable, so that's not the right question to ask. The question we have to ask is, as we're thinking about a particular policy, what distributive value is most important to us, or what combination of distributive values are most important to us? Do we care most about equality? Do we care about adequacy, or do we care about providing opportunities for flourishing for the least advantaged? Notice that our term educational goods can come back in here. When we talk about equality, we need to be talking about equality of educational goods, the equality of opportunity for flourishing. Flourishing is our key notion. That doesn't mean that we should be promoting equality of test scores or just cognitive skills, because we need to think much more broadly about the broader set of educational goods. Adequacy should be in terms of educational goods as well. So let's go to the next one. So just as another brief example, and I've just been alluding to this, a lot of people talk about, well, what we're trying to do is reduce achievement gaps. Does it make sense to put all this focus, policy focus, on reducing achievement gaps? Well, achievement, as measured imperfectly by test scores, are just one of many educational goods. So I'm down here in the second bullet here. What we really want to do is equalize the basket of educational goods and think hard about the extent to which schools can do this. And we need to think hard about why we care about differences in achievement. Anyway, if we're talking about fifth graders versus third graders, fifth graders are going to have higher achievement levels than third graders. Why? So that's fine. But when we have differences in achievement across groups in society that we care about, that may lead us to pay more attention to achievement gaps in that sense. But once again, achievement itself, especially as measured by test scores, is only one of many measures we care about. Now, just so you know where we're going, Susanna's going to give a few more examples. Then we have an exercise for you all to participate in. And
Don't run out, we've locked the door.
So Susanna and Harry have some materials. You're going to get to make some trade-offs in terms of the values and to think about what sort of evidence you'd need. And we'll give you an opportunity to do that, and then we'll have some feedback based on that.
Okay, so here's just a quick way to look at charter schools. So you would have something like, what might charter schools do? And they reduce regulations, so you could have greater variation in kind of the quality of schools. We have freer school entry, so potentially we get good new schools in, depending on who the chartering authority is. You have parents' choice, more parents' choice, so maybe you get a better match of kids to schools, and maybe you get competitive pressures from parents' choice, maybe not. And then you've got outcome-based accountability, so there's this focus on test scores. So this is just kind of our summary of what a charter school policy does. So using the framework, let's consider which values we're talking about here. And this is what we would do. We would say, okay, does it affect educational goods? Does it affect childhood goods? Does it affect other goods? Does it affect parents' interests? Those kinds of things. And if we did something like that, we would say, yes, it probably does affect both the level and the distribution, as well as which of the childhood goods we focus on. So there's a push towards achievement when you've got achievement test scores, though parents may balance that out a little bit as you push towards parents' values there. It's possible that it affects childhood goods as well, because people can make choices about childhood goods, or the focus on achievement might pull away from a focus of schools on childhood goods. So we'd want to keep that in mind. Chances are that it doesn't really affect current consumption or other goods, since we're not really changing funding, but it does really affect parents' interest, okay? And these other two, not so much. So then we would say, okay, well, let's think about what charters do in this world and what the evidence is. Let's bring the evidence to bear. And basically, I think that we have evidence that it affects the distribution of parents' interest. Parents tend to like having choice. Parent satisfaction tends to be higher. And we know that for some kids, there are some great gains from schools. Though, we don't know, we don't have evidence on for all. But for some low-income students, achievement in particular has gone up. But we know there's greater quality variation, with some worse off, and somewhat increased segregation. Okay, so we have some evidence on that. But really, we have very sparse evidence on a lot of what we think charter schools might affect. Other measures of educational goods, aside from test scores, we have very little evidence on that. We certainly have very little evidence on its effect on childhood goods, for example. So the idea here is that the framework is supposed to give you a sense of where you would want to get evidence for the policy questions that you have. So the point is basically, I'll just put those up. We're just trying to create some clarity that makes it easier to think about probably what you're already thinking about in the back of your head or in the back of your mind about when you're thinking about policies. We were just trying to put words on it, because once you put words on it, you can actually have a discussion more clearly. And I think it's really helped us in our discussion about these things as well. Okay, so what is the process? Generally, we identify a 4-stage process. And the first two, you could do one or the other one first. So either what you do is you identify which values you care about. Let's say what I want to do is have some increase adequacy or increase equality or increase childhood goods, something like that. You could identify values, or you could identify some key decisions. Should we allow districts to raise money in addition to what the state gives the district? A decision like that. So you could really start at either one of those. And then what you do is you assess the options. You say, okay, which values come into play? And then what does the evidence say about how my decisions will affect the values that we care about? And then so you have this evidence for the values that you care about. And then from there, you establish the best policy for your situation, given your circumstances. Now, in the book, we do the first 3, but we don't do the last one. And we identify this as something you need to do to make a decision, but we don't do it because it depends a lot on how good the evidence is. A lot of times we haven't collected the evidence we need to know exactly what the values are, what the effect of our choices will be on the values that we care about. But in addition to that, some of us may weigh values, the things we value differently. In general, we think we've identified values that most people care about, that they are values for most people. But for example, like we mentioned, some people may put more weight on parents' interest, and some people might put less weight on parents' interest. Some may put more weight on economic productivity, and some may put more weight on treating others as equals. So you've got some differences in how we weight them, even though we all care about them. And you have to make that last choice step, that fourth step, but the book is designed to kind of identify the step, but when we go through the policies, we don't actually make that step. Okay, so instead of doing a finance example, which I was going to do, we're just going to go to your try. Okay. And the way that we're going to do this is I'm just going to present a choice for you, and then we'd love for you just to turn to the two people next to you and have a discussion about it, and I will we'll show you two questions for you to answer, and then we're going to have a discussion about them. Okay, so there was a New York Times article in last May that said, "Why are New York schools segregated? It's not as simple as housing." And basically the idea is that there's a choice system. What the article says is that there's a school choice system in New York, and parents are making choices, and actually the higher income parents and the white and Asian families are less likely to choose to leave their schools. The black families in the city in particular are most likely to choose to leave their schools, but where they go to varies. So the white and Asian families that are making choices are the ones in more integrated neighborhoods, and they're moving to more segregated, more white and Asian schools, whereas the black families are more staying within largely black schools in the city. And as a result, the choice system is actually increasing the segregation in the city. Okay, so that's basically going on. And in addition to that, now this again is just on achievement, but that means that black students in particular are ending up in schools with concentrations of very low performing students. Okay, so there's inequality in the test scores of the schools. For example, if you look at white students, only 13% of third graders are in the lowest quarter of schools in the city, while 30% essentially of black students are in the lowest performing schools in the city. Okay, so this is a serious inequality, and you've seen more about selective schools probably in New York this last couple of weeks, but these are not selective schools. This is just inequality in the non-selective schools in the city. Okay, so let's say there's some political will to reduce inequality, and there are two options that have been put up as possibilities. The first is to reduce choice and desegregate strategically. And the second is to reallocate funds to schools with students more in need. So put more money into the low-performing schools or reduce choice and desegregate. Okay? So step one in the process would be to identify which values are in play given these choices. So in this case, we kind of went step two and then step one. Which educational goods are in play, which independent values are in play, and which distributive values are in play. And then once we do that, we want to say, okay, we know which values are in play. What evidence do we need? So what evidence would you like to see that would help you to understand what the likely effect of your two choices are? And how might you get that? So basically what we're going to ask you to do is step one and step three. What values are in play, and what evidence would you like to know that would help you move to step four and decide which policy that you want? So again, it's reduce choice and desegregate or reallocate funds to student in need. We're going to put up this slide, which has all these educational goods, distributive values, and independent values. And what we'd like you to do for about 5 minutes is to talk to the person next to you about which values are in play, and then we'll say, okay, 5 minutes is up, and then we're going to turn to what evidence for 5 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. Harry, do you want to?
All right. All right. Oh, yeah, that really makes me more audible, doesn't it? So you can all... Good, very good. So now we just want to debrief. Our plan is to have about 10 minutes of debriefing and then 10 minutes for Q&A. We can move into Q&A faster if you want. So anybody want to report back from their group what you thought about, what you decided, if you decided something, and why? You're like my bloody business students. Go ahead. Loud. You've got to be really loud for everybody.
Why don't you stand up?
Yeah.
So we talked a lot, and I'm not sure we landed on a solid answer, but I think we were both leaning toward different solutions, different responses.
And what were the considerations, one way or the other? I mean, what explains the difference in your leanings?
Well, we're still in the middle. I don't think we're finished, but I think there's some perhaps disagreement, or we believe differently in how parents will act. Will they act in the interest of everyone, or do they are biased definitely towards their own children? If you, in the top choice, if you desegregate, you're kind of implying that there's, I think, something wrong with the concentrations of certain types of students, and thinking the solution is to dilute that population. But a really good point was that bringing in more economically diverse, wealthier families, you're going to bring in resources through the back door, as opposed to the other one where you're bringing it in through the front door and you can direct it towards policy, hiring specific types of teachers with skills and perhaps histories of being successful with certain types of students.
Other groups report back.
And even just like, which educational goods did you think
Yeah.
were in play in this decision?
I think we decided for reallocating funds. Do you want to stand up just so?
Louder, Maria. Yeah.
We decided for reallocating funds to students in Morton. And she's going to explain why.
All right, come on then, Diane. You've been put on the spot now.
Well, and I actually thought the primary values were in the distributive values. And I thought the educational goods were actually secondary when I was thinking about it in terms of priority to less advantage with very targeted funding versus, equality and adequacy argument. But when we started to talk about the evidence, and I said, well, part of it is so what is the evidence that you bring in? And there's been other models, and particularly when you look at the political and historical models of trying to desegregate and reduce choice. That was part of the evidence, as some of the sociological literature saying the other models, were problematic and they had unintended ripple effects where this was targeted funds. And so we kind of played with that. In terms of the independent values, the parents' interest, independent choice, you might put an element of democratic process and community influence in terms of what those shifts are. And so we kind of played with, where I got stuck was, I was kind of curious from the public policy and the economists is, where do you gather the evidence for those kind of nuanced elements in terms of the prioritization of, is it student achievement, is it more of the historic or political context, and where it's publicly available. And so I'm like, okay, I'm thinking it'd be interesting to see where the other models are in terms of how is it played out in terms of, Ree was saying in terms of the redistribution, the allocation of targeted funds, does it correlate to any kind of improved achievement? Can we take the parallel of that evidence into a New York context? And so I struggled in terms of, well, would I take it from a Kane concept of Stats Canada? Would I take it from, some qualitative research? And so that's where I kind of went, this is good, but am I just kind of confirming my biases and assumptions of leading kind of the values? And so that's where I think sometimes the educational research group could learn from a broader spectrum across the disciplines in terms of how we might get more nuanced and robust evidence to support the values that we're trying to make in our policy decisions.
Good. Keep going.
Others, you can you can report from your own group, or you can comment on what's already been said. So you've got now two options. Go ahead.
So we kind of had a slightly similar discussion. We were also talking simply about the role of risk.
Do you want to, why don't you turn around just so everybody can hear?
We were sort of implicitly talking about the role of risk and how you calibrate or weight the values. We talked about how, for example, we would gather evidence on desegregation and madness, right? But our context today is kind of different. We're choice than their parents. So does that change the calculation, and how do you gather new evidence? Where, for example, you know, if you look at reducing choice, a lot of people may cringe, you know, because that's reducing freedom, potential interest, but there may be a generation that is willing to forgo some of that if that's going to make it less risky for them to obtain, you know, the kind of practice.
Go ahead.
We were, the three of us, an example of how context defines how you should choose, because I come from the Netherlands and my colleagues here from the United States. And in the Netherlands, we have chosen decades ago the second option.
Yeah.
Education is completely free of charge. Even university education is almost free of charge. The choice for school is completely free. There is nowadays a lottery in Amsterdam, but let's say in general, choice is free. All schools are of the good quality with an inspector who helps the school when the quality is not up to standards. So did paradise arrive? Would you do this in the United States? There will always be no questions. For instance, question, we all think here, I think, I assume, that segregation is not good, is in itself not good. What I have seen in my own research in the larger cities in the Netherlands, that students with a migrant background, let's say Turkish, Moroccan migrant background, choose for a school with even a higher percentage of children or students with the same background when there is a more integrated school close to their home.
Mm-hmm.
And my assumption is that they do this, I have to research into this further, that they do this because they want to have the right to maintain their own culture. And I would be most interested in labor market results to see in hindsight what the choice for a specific school does for an individual over a lifetime on the labor market, because in the end that is what counts.
Yeah, I haven't been commenting on what people have been saying, but context is important in a number of ways. So it's important because, of course, your context, using the map example, the context is where you are. And if you don't know where you are, you can know where you're going and have the map, but it's still no use to you. But it's also important because in different contexts, you might think that different values may, you might think, well, we're doing pretty well with regard to equality, so we care more about other values now. But it also, I think it's Diane's point really about the evidence. You need to be careful when you take evidence from one context and use it in making judgments about another context. Sometimes it works reasonably well. I think our cardiovascular systems are reasonably alike. But as soon as it gets into, cultural and social structural differences, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but you need to be super careful about doing it, and of course much more careful than politicians tend to be.
Can I just?
Yeah, go ahead.
I love having somebody from the Netherlands because I've done a lot of work on weighted student funding in the Netherlands. One of the things you said, Elsbeth, we all know segregation is bad, but then you wanted evidence related to future labor markets. Which of our educational goods helps you think about why segregation might be bad? And anybody can answer this. So which of the educational goods comes up there? We might turn to somebody else just to give them.
So this is why I kept on fighting with the way you construed values, because I think they were construed as individual goods, not public goods. And the whole way this question was posed about school segregation was its effect on individual students and not its effect on the civic culture and the life of the city. And so set of methodological assumptions that made you construe it in this way. But I mean, the reasons why segregation are bad are yes, some of it has to do with how it affects students, and part of what this doesn't also get to is how racial segregation and class segregation work in tandem. But it's also bad because of what it does to the society as a whole if we have a vision of a kind of democratic pluralist society.
So let me just follow up. So I would say you're emphasizing one of our values here, which is democratic competence. So kids are in schools, and you might bring up the educational good of democratic competence. Are there any others of our educational goods that might show up clearly in this case?
Totally. Yeah.
Actually, kind of wanted to build on what we're saying, because I think you put a finger on something we were struggling with, and this also relates a little bit to the previous comment as well. On the one hand, we talked about the idea that one thing that parents value, but which is also potentially a societal good, is and an individual is membership in their local community, or sort of those community ties, or in their cultural origin community, which would actually be a good of segregation. And then a good of desegregation would be more in the regarding others as a whole. I sort of wanted to shove it in that box, but the being able to all get along with each other from with people from outside your community, which I'm not quite sure where to stump on that set of goods and values. But which is, I think, one of the goods that people are sort of assuming of desegregation being a good outcome, apart from economic disparities, or the different groups end up being better or worse schools.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is a great discussion because it is really pointing, maybe it didn't come across as well as we wanted to, but to these capacities that we were talking about, because they're not just kind of skills like labor market skills or being able to like pull a, I guess you don't have to do that anymore to vote, it's not filling out a form, it's like your attitudes towards your participation in a community, your dispositions to treat others as equals. All these kinds of things are capacities that sit in an individual that we value, but we value them because they create these communities and these that we're aiming to create. So I think, and sometimes we know the effects of whether segregation helps it or hurts it, and sometimes we don't, and it's more a question of evidence. And it is true that, being in a community that you feel comfortable with may help you develop these attitudes of wanting to contribute to your community, or they may not. And that's what we don't have as much evidence on as might be useful for a conversation like that. So, sorry to get
We had a, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add,
You want to stand up just so everybody can hear?
actually, I just want to thank you for the book, too. I partway through reading it, I found it very helpful. So
thanks.
good to hear. But I just want to add, I think for the, in addition to democratic competence and regarding others as equal, which is what we talked about here, too, I think it's the case also for economic productivity as well. I think when you look at the research on kind of diverse organizations, and then that's mixed to a degree, but I think it's positive, that you can make the case for that as well. I think what I struggled with when I was thinking about these educational goods is also it's hard to separate in your mind, like, oh wait, is there evidence for that?
Yeah.
And I would kind of jump, kind of back and forth into one of these. But that's stuff. Yeah.
Good. Wanna?
So we were also talking a little bit about the way in which maybe childhood is, and this sort of broad idea of having the kind of childhood is essential for a healthy adulthood might also be difficult and affected by either of these two options.
Yeah.
One of the things might be able to discern how students at different ages, even quite young kids, how their experience is going, how it manifests, and what's important for them. And to what extent, when we think about where can we go to find evidence, I'm wondering, what we could meaningfully get from the kids themselves.
So can I just say something about that? So one of the things that we are reacting against is a kind of relentless focus on achievement data as the only relevant evidence. Now, we think it matters, and we do think we think it's informative, but there's this tendency to make decisions about the evidence you've got rather than look for the evidence that you need to make the decisions. And in the book, there is now a significant philosophical literature about childhood goods. In the book, we very briefly discuss the idea, but one of the things that I don't think that is yet connected to is either quantitative or qualitative research. And when you don't have you've got instincts, and there are things. I'm pretty sure that being beaten about the head every day is pretty bad for childhood goods. Even if it were good for achievement, it would be bad for childhood goods. But, the kinds of things, we have very limited evidence because, partly because it's hard to study, but also partly because people haven't had the language to identify this as something that really matters. And so I don't have an answer for you. What our hope is that, we've got lots of really smart researchers here. One of the things that they will go away and think about is, okay, how could we get good, informative evidence about the level of childhood goods in certain kinds of classrooms, certain kinds of schools, under certain kinds of circumstances. And, that's childhood goods, but for other things too. It's 24 degrees centigrade, which it keeps telling us, and it's oh, no, we got to 150?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Oh, well, we've got a whole another 10 minutes. Go ahead, Maria.
That last comment and evidence, thank you very much, because I think it's very important. We haven't talked much about evidence here.
Can you turn around just so they can all hear you?
Much about evidence here in this discussion must be focusing on educational goods and values. But as an evaluation researcher myself, one of the things that I would like to see is, and also following up on your comment, because we are talking about different contexts, different people, different societies. These policies have been around for a long time. So it's possible to have a more innovative way of thinking about this. And then to me, one of the ways to do this is really to consider the policymakers as the people who are actually implementing change, the people in the schools, the teachers, the parents, the children. And so then develop, different models, including taking account democracy and other ways of thinking about how do we implement innovation, which could be a combination of things, not only one or the other, and then think about how we evaluate. In other words, we should maybe collect the evidence ourselves, right? The people who are doing the work, how do we manage to collect that evidence? It should be done with, high research rigor, but the people collecting the evidence longitudinally in the schools. It requires a huge effort, and it requires developing the capacity of those people who are following the street level bureaucrats, right, that are doing that kind of work. So really, one of the things I have been fighting for a long time in the adoption of the research, how do you get people who are doing the work also to come to the and collect their own data for an organization that I think can be done. So that's one of the things I want to clarify, because evidence we're talking about big data, but sometimes big data achievement tests,
Yeah.
it's not as useful as the data that you're collecting day-to-day to prove your practices. So formative and then eventually summative evidence.
Yeah. Other questions or comments or interventions? Go ahead.
So I was interested to hear you mention that, this overall system here, which I really love in terms of the stuff on the table, is context specific. My colleague here, we were having a discussion, me from a British perspective and from a Canadian perspective, and sort of trying to puzzle through an American case, really gave us pause to sort of stop and think about, well, actually, to what extent does the context you're operating in kind of shape the way in which each of these goods is understood. So what I'm kind of curious about is, do you have a sort of a sense or an imagination about, are there sort of boundaries, right? Are there context boundaries beyond which this framework would sort of begin to come under stress? I'm thinking, for example, about levels of polarization, where for some people, the way in which individual choice is understood, the way in which parental interest is understood, in the promotion of certain moral values actually sort of arises in wanting to control the choices that other people make, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, are we dependent on a certain level of agreement, political agreement?
So I can give you a context where I would feel very uncomfortable using the framework. So but it's an extreme context, and then I don't know. So, you're 1937 in Berlin, you're teaching Jewish kids. Now, at that point, still flourishing is like, I want their flourishing, I want to maximize it. Do I want them to be democratically competent? Well, maybe I do, but what that means is very different from what it would mean in normal times. So, I want to teach them how to protect themselves, how to preserve themselves. I want to get them out of there, basically, is the main thing. But, so there's that. So I think we probably, even in that context, I think that with work I could, show you how these abstract things still work out as being informative or useful, but I do get very uncomfortable in that situation. So, in reasonably wealthy liberal democracies in normal political times, I'm very comfortable with this. What counts as normal political times, I still believe that we, and even you, I know you don't feel like it right now, but, over the last couple of weeks, but even in the UK, we're in, relatively normal political times over the, But, Pinochet's Chile, Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, no, probably, maybe, even then I think I could do something, but I don't think this would be very helpful, and I think it's just very clear what the urgent things are there. Not clear what to do, but clear that what's urgent. Does that help?
Harry, I'd like to just add that we intend this to be used at all levels. I have found, thinking about the concept of educational goods and the way we've spelled them out, which isn't the only way to spell them out, is incredibly useful at lots of different levels. So think about being within a school, and some people within the school are saying, we really ought to invest more resources in arts, or in art classes and music classes, and maybe social studies. And the answer they might well get is, well, yes, we could invest more resources in those as long as you can show us that art and music or social studies increase students' test scores. We haven't had a language, or the art teachers and the social studies teachers haven't had a language that will allow them to join the debate and say, maybe art classes and music classes are valuable in their own right because personal fulfillment is one of the educational goods. So this doesn't have to be at the level of policymakers at the national level or the state level. It's to change the conversations and to get us thinking about what it is we really value. Do we value the ability of students to do a good job filling in bubbles on test scores, or do we care about a broader set of educational goods? If we care about a broader set of educational goods, even if we don't have all the evidence we need to push strong policy, what would we need? So last thing I'll say on this, I've studied in the Netherlands and New Zealand and England and whatever, and I've become a fan of inspection systems, because if you care, for example, about childhood goods, there's no way our test-based accountability in the US is going to tell us whether schools are doing a good job, giving kids an opportunity to be curious and to play and whatever. So the language matters to me a lot.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks. I really appreciate your comment about how this is meant to give a tool, right, to have these conversations, to investigate this. But, you just brought up this if-then statement, right? So if we believe and value this, then this is what will be the result. I think a challenge with these values investigations, so we have to wrestle with our own, I guess, hypocrisy, right? And I lack the philosophical, theoretical framework to discuss a lot of this, but it just some things we were wrestling with back here. We didn't use these specific examples, but you think of today it's popular or common for people to talk about their values on immigration policy.
Yeah.
So I'm deeply opposed to the border wall, I say, from in the house of my gated community, right?
Yeah.
These sorts of things. And it's like, well, how deeply are your values, really, if your actions this way? So it reminds me of folks who say, oh, well, college isn't for everybody, and they're rarely talking about their own children, right?
Yeah.
Those sorts of positions. And so while I think this is a great framework, I'm just mildly overwhelmed, if that's a thing, or mildly overwhelmed by like the work we have ahead of us to not just say, oh yeah, I truly believe this, it's a core value, like going, okay, well, what actions do we exhibit that exemplify these things? So I'm interested to get the book and to get into this, but man, what a challenging new way forward.
So this is the book that we want to sell. I will just say our co-author, who is not here, has written a previous book called How Not to Be a Hypocrite, which is exactly on your it's exactly on your issue. It doesn't. It's a toolkit on how not to be a hypocrite, which is good, and it's around schooling. I want to do two things before we go. One is, since Elizabeth's here, this is our editor, Elizabeth Branch Dyson, who was not only an excellent editor, but also an extremely patient one. So we're really grateful to her. And I do want to encourage you to get the book and see if you can make use of it and see if you can do something with the concepts in it. We are out of time. We're genuinely out of time now, as opposed to being out of the time that I thought we had. So thanks, everybody, for coming and for participating so well.